Most stories about grief begin with quiet sadness, but today's story doesn't start that way. It starts with something strange, something so chilling that, when it finally became public years later, newspapers described it as one of the most unsettling encounters ever recorded in rural England. And the woman at the center of it had no idea she was walking straight into it. In September of 1885, a young widow named Mary stepped out of a horse-drawn carriage and onto a lonely dirt road, the sound of wheels fading behind her until the countryside became completely silent. She had traveled nearly 100 miles from London, far from the noise, the people, and the memories she was trying so desperately to escape. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a sudden accident, and though time had passed, the grief hadn't softened. It followed her like a shadow. Ahead of her stood a large, aging country house belonging to her late husband's aunt. The woman had invited Mary to stay for a while, hoping the peace of the countryside might soothe her. Mary adjusted her grip on her single suitcase, took a long breath, and walked up to the door. Moments after she knocked, the aunt's maid opened it, smiling politely before taking Mary's bag upstairs. Mary didn't stop to rest. She went straight down the narrow hallway, toward the bedroom where the aunt spent most of her days. When she knocked and gently pushed open the door, she found the old woman lying in bed, weak and frail, but smiling warmly when she recognized her. Mary sat beside her, and for several minutes the two women exchanged soft, harmless small talk, the journey from London, the chilly weather, the still quiet fields outside. But then, without warning, the aunt's expression changed. Her smile faded, her eyes filled with a heavy, aching sympathy, and she asked Mary a question the younger woman had spent 2 years avoiding. "My dear," the aunt whispered, "how are you holding up?" At that moment, Mary felt her chest tighten and her throat clench, the grief hitting her like a wave she hadn't prepared for. She looked away, blinking fast, trying not to break down. She knew exactly what the aunt meant. Mary was young, but she was already a widow, and the love of her life was buried miles behind her in London. She had come here for peace, but within 24 hours, she would discover something in this house that would change her understanding of death forever. That first night in the old house passed quietly. Mary had dinner with the aunt and the maid, exchanged a few soft words, and then retired early. Grief was exhausting, and the long journey had drained her completely. The guest room was small but warm, with a single candle flickering on the bedside table and a large window overlooking the moonlit fields. Mary lay down, letting the silence of the countryside settle around her. For the first time in months, she felt like she might finally sleep without waking up in tears. But sometime after midnight, she woke abruptly. No sound, no movement. Just this overwhelming sense that someone had walked into the room. Her eyes snapped open. The candle had burned down to a faint glow, barely illuminating the walls. For a moment, she told herself it was only a dream, only nerves, only grief. But then she noticed the door. It was open, wide open. Mary distinctly remembered closing it before she went to bed, pulling it shut with the same habit she'd had since childhood. But now, in the dead stillness of the night, the door stood halfway ajar, as if someone had quietly pushed it open and slipped inside. Her breath caught in her throat. She listened carefully. Nothing. Just the creaking of the old house settling. She sat up slowly, heart thudding against her ribs, and whispered into the darkness, "Hello?" No answer. After several tense minutes, she convinced herself it was the maid checking on her. Or maybe the latch was loose. Old houses behaved strangely. She closed the door gently and returned to bed, though her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the blanket over herself. But sleep didn't come. Because the moment she closed her eyes, she felt something Mary hadn't felt since the day her husband died. The sensation of being watched. It wasn't imagined. It wasn't subtle. It was strong enough that the hairs on her arms stood on end. Eventually, morning light crept into the room, and the feeling vanished as quickly as it had come. Mary told herself she had overreacted. She was tired, grieving, and emotional. The mind plays tricks when it wants to. Except later that day, while helping the aunt with her tea, Mary casually mentioned the door to her, just a passing comment, expecting the old woman to laugh it off. But instead, the aunt froze. Her teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway. She swallowed once, hard, before whispering, My dear, this house has doors that open on their own, but not because of wind. Mary stared at her. What do you mean? She asked. The aunt hesitated, then looked directly at Mary with a kind of tired fear, the kind that comes from years of knowing something you wish you didn't. Some nights, the aunt murmured, I hear footsteps, soft, slow, right outside my room, but when the maid checks, there is no one. Mary felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine, but the aunt wasn't finished. And once, she whispered, I woke to find a man standing in the doorway, a tall man, silent, watching me. Mary's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't know it yet, but she had just heard the first clue, the first warning, about something in this house that did not belong to the living. And before the week was over, Mary would come face to face with it herself. Over the next 2 days, Mary tried to convince herself that the aunt's warning was nothing more than the ramblings of an elderly, bedridden woman who had spent too many nights alone in a creaking old house. But the feeling inside the place, an uneasy heaviness that settled in the hallways and lingered in the corners, was becoming harder to ignore. Even the maid, usually cheerful and polite, moved through the rooms with a stiffness Mary had not noticed before, as if she, too, sensed something watching from the shadows. On the third night, Mary decided to stay awake a little longer. She sat on the edge of the guest bed, reading by the candlelight, trying to distract herself from the growing tension in her chest. The house was quiet, so quiet she could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock downstairs. Nothing unusual, nothing strange. But then, sometime after 1 a.m., she heard it, a soft, deliberate footstep. Not the house creaking, not pipes shifting, a footstep, slow, controlled, right outside her door. Mary froze, the candle flame flickering as her breath caught. She waited, her ears sharpening to the slightest sound. Another step, and then another. The footsteps were moving down the hallway, slow, heavy, and unmistakably human. They didn't sound like the maid's careful stride or the aunt's shuffling walk. This was different. This sounded like a man. Mary's heart hammered inside her chest. She stood up, taking one quiet step toward the door. The footsteps stopped instantly, as if whoever or whatever was outside had realized she was listening. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. She held her breath, waiting. Then, with a sudden creak, the handle of her door began to turn. Not violently, not quickly. Just a slow, steady twist, as though someone on the other side was testing how quietly they could open it. Mary stumbled backward, fear rising through her like cold water. Before the door could fully open, she lunged forward and slammed it shut with all her strength, twisting the lock with shaking hands. The moment the latch clicked, the footsteps started again. But now, it wasn't walking. It was pacing, back and forth, right outside her door, a slow, dragging rhythm that sent icy chills up her spine. Mary backed away, staring at the door, terrified that at any moment the lock would turn and the door would swing open. And then, the footsteps stopped. A long pause, followed by a sound that made Mary's blood run cold. A man's voice, right on the other side of the door, whispering her name. Mary! Her knees nearly buckled. It wasn't her husband's voice. It wasn't anyone she knew. It was deep, breathy, and impossibly calm, as though whoever was standing there wasn't trying to frighten her, but claim her. Mary couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. The whisper came again, softer this time. Mary, open the door. She stumbled backward until she hit the wall. The candle flickered violently and went out, and in the pitch-black darkness, she heard something that turned her terror into pure animal panic. The man on the other side of the door laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew, without any doubt, that this house belonged to him, and that Mary was not going to leave it untouched. Mary stayed pressed against the wall, every muscle in her body trembling, as the laughter on the other side of the door slowly faded into silence. She didn't dare move, not even to breathe properly. She just stared into the darkness, praying, desperately, that the lock would hold until morning. Hours crawled by like years. She didn't sleep. She didn't blink. She just waited for the sun to save her. When dawn finally spilled faint light into the room, Mary forced herself to unlock the door. Her hands shook so violently she could barely turn it. When she opened the door just an inch, she expected to see footprints, scratches, something, anything. to prove a living person had been there. There was nothing. The hallway was empty. Still, even the air felt dead. The maid found Mary standing frozen in the doorway and immediately noticed the look on her face. When Mary explained everything, the footsteps, the turning handle, the whispering voice, the maid didn't react with disbelief. She reacted with fear. Real fear. Her face drained of color, and she kept glancing down the hall like she expected something to appear at any second. Without hesitation, the maid led Mary straight to the aunt's bedroom. Mary expected comfort, answers, reassurance. What she got instead shattered everything she thought she knew. The aunt, pale and exhausted, listened silently as Mary recounted the entire night. When she finished, her aunt didn't look surprised or confused. She only nodded slowly, as if everything Mary described was something she already knew. And then the aunt said a sentence that made Mary collapse into a chair. "He has been here since the day your husband died." Mary stared at her, stunned. "What do you mean he? Who is he?" The aunt closed her eyes, voice barely above a whisper. "The one your husband saw before he passed." The room went silent. Mary's heart dropped. She shook her head, refusing to understand. But the aunt continued. "Your husband told us days before the accident that a man was following him, a man no one else could see, standing in hallways, outside windows, at night, by the bed." She looked directly into Mary's eyes. "He said the man whispered your name." Mary felt the world tilt. Her husband, her sweet, gentle husband, had never told her any of this. Not once, but the aunt insisted he'd confided in the family, terrified that this figure wasn't following him, but waiting for Mary. The maid stepped forward, voice shaking. "He only appears after someone loses the person they love most. It's like he feeds on grief." Mary felt sick. The aunt took her hand and said the words Mary would remember for the rest of her life. "He wasn't here to haunt your husband. He was here to take you." Mary's breath caught. And then the aunt said one more thing. "That's why I asked you to come, because he's in this house now, and he won't leave unless you do." That was all Mary needed to hear. She packed her belongings in under 3 minutes. She didn't wait for tea or breakfast or polite goodbyes. She didn't even look back at the guest room. The maid helped her load her suitcase into the carriage, urging her to leave before the sun fully set. Mary left the house with her heart pounding, never once letting herself look at the windows. Terrified she'd see a dark figure standing behind the glass, and for the rest of her life, she never returned to that village, never visited that house again, never spoke of the man in the hallway, but every now and then, in the quiet moments, in a dark room, she swore she could still hear that same slow, breathy whisper behind her. "Mary." If you were in Mary's place, if you heard slow, heavy footsteps outside your door in the middle of the night, and the doorknob began to quietly turn on its own, would you run? Or would you freeze in place the way Mary did? Tell me in the comments. Who do you think it was? A person? Or something else entirely? And if you want me to create another story on a specific topic, mystery, or true event, then drop your suggestion below. What should the next story be about?